Hello, and welcome to a live recording of Found, TechCrunch's podcast that brings you the stories behind the startups. I'm Becca Szkutak, and joining me today in person is my fabulous co-host,
Dominic-Madori Davis, and today we're talking to Kai Kloepfer, who is the CEO and founder of Biofire, a firearms company that makes weapons that use fingerprints and facial recognition technology to unlock only for their owners and registered users.
But before we dive into today's conversation, just wanted to do a quick note for the audience. We are talking about guns here, which can be a controversial subject, as well as some other sensitive areas, including things like suicide and mass shootings, just so no one in the audience is surprised at any point. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and get into it. Kai, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me today.
No, thanks for coming. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about Biofire?
Yeah, I think you guys gave a great intro already, but Biofire is a Series A stage startup. We're based out in Colorado, and our focus is how can we use the best-in-class technology and innovation that's, we're also good at both here in Silicon Valley as well as more broadly in America, and apply it to some uniquely American challenges around gun death, in particular with a focus on suicides and accidents. And so I'm sure we'll get into some of the details, but I've been working on this space and this challenge for, I think, 13 years here in November. And what we've worked on and very much focused on at this point is what we call a smart gun, basically a handgun designed for home defense for your sort of average American that's looking to have a firearm in the home. And the key difference is it's always locked by default, right? So rather than a traditional gun where you always have to take some sort of deliberate action to secure that firearm, which is not always possible, you can make a mistake, and obviously those mistakes lead to children getting access to guns, teenagers getting access to guns. With the Biofire Smart Gun, it's always locked by default. And so as within about 100 seconds after it leaves your hands for any reason, it's going to be unusable to anybody else. But on the flip side, as soon as you pick it up, it authenticates the owner or somebody the owner chosen with biometrics, which then allow it to function like a traditional firearm. So we'll get into more details, but that's the high level.
But I have to know, why don't you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this space to begin with? Because I know you started working on this project, this company, in high school.
Yeah, so I grew up in Colorado, which is where we're now based, obviously, and in the wake of the Aurora theater shooting, which at the time that's where somebody went into a movie theater, and at the time it was one of the I think the worst mass shootings in U.S. history. I was 15 at the time and started to think about how can I use my passion, interest in engineering and building things, very appropriate for the huge words behind my head here, and how could I have an impact here in some way? And started very small, right? I don't want to say that, I sat down, I'm going to go, build a firearms manufacturing company as a 15-year-old. But much more so, really just start working on it as a science fair project, thinking about how can I sort of think about the fundamentals of what a solution in this space would look like. And obviously, the concept of a smart gun is not a new one, right? James Bond has a smart gun, Judge Dredd has a smart gun. It's been a very compelling concept in science fiction and media for a very long time. In practice, the actual technical challenges required to successfully build a highly reliable, extremely fast product that actually delivers on sort of the fundamental premise that a customer is buying into, right? That it's going to work 100% of the time for me and it's never going to work for anybody I don't want. It is very, very challenging. I'll spoil the punchline, but it took over $30 million. And so definitely didn't do that in high school, but long story short, I ended up winning first place at the Intel International Science Fair in Engineering that year with what eventually became Biofire, a smart gun concept. And obviously I was 16 at that point. You can't work on guns for the science fair, so it was a mock-up of a firearm. But that was really how I got started and transitioned into what Biofire eventually became today.
So it's always interesting to me because what you're working on now and what you were working on then obviously wouldn't have made a difference in the Aurora shooting, in the event that kind of inspired you to look into this area. So what was the connection there? And sort of why did you decide to build this based off of that inspiration?
Absolutely. One of the very first, I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, I have always, as much as possible, this could be very challenging to do in all environments, but try to approach things from a very quantitative perspective. And the first thing that I did when starting to look at broadly the space of, what are the public health challenges in America around guns? And what I was personally very surprised to see at the time was that over 2/3 of people that lose their lives to firearms in the United States is the result of suicides and accidents, right? We hear a tremendous amount about mass shootings, about violent crime, about these very unfortunately splashy, attention-grabbing kind of challenges, but there's a sort of steady drumbeat, unfortunately, of American lives that are being lost to suicides and accidents. And in a lot of ways, I knew I wasn't going to be building some sort of, socio-political solution, right? That's not my area of expertise. It was going to be something that was physical. It was going to be a product. It was going to be hardware. And in a lot of ways, there's a fundamental difference between most suicides and all accidents and violent crime, which is that in violent crime, you have a bad actor, a criminal who's looking to commit a crime with a firearm, versus in most suicides and with accidents, the firearm is being used in a way that the owner doesn't intend. And so there was a really interesting opportunity to align Biofire and the product's incentives with the incentives of our customers, right? How can we build something that better equips gun owners with tools to realize their existing objectives instead of some sort of adversarial kind of relationship? And I think that's really the foundation of a good product.
And I know that you're not necessarily the first company to try and build a smart gun. And in the past 13 years, I'm sure you've faced a lot of pushback, especially from lobbies. Why are people so against the idea of like a personalized smart gun, even if it means more safety?
I would push back on that a little bit. I don't actually think that people are against the concept of a smart gun, right? The premise, I've talked to tens of thousands of people over the years I've been doing this in person and via forums like this, and I've never actually heard anybody argue against the concept, right? A concept of a firearm that works perfectly for the owner or somebody they've chosen and it doesn't work for anybody else. And even more so, I'm a gun owner myself. I've spent a lot of time with other gun owners and enthusiasts, as well as expert professional users of firearms like the law enforcement community and military. And the number one concern of any firearm owner is going to be, is this firearm going to be used in a way I don't intend, right? Because I forgot to secure it, because it's taken away from me. That is the number one front of mind concern for anybody that owns a firearm. And so for sure, I don't want to downplay it. Like, there's been substantial pushback in the past, mostly 10 to 20 years ago, against smart guns. And the reason for that, I think, is actually very simple. Smart guns didn't exist, right? All the concepts and prototypes that various different companies were looking at were not viable or functional as firearms or as smart guns, right? They didn't actually work. They were not reliable. In many cases, they cost 5 to 10 times the cost of a comparable product. And in a lot of cases, I think you can boil down everything that Biofire has done to very simple. We actually solved the technical problem, and then, of course, built a viable business around that.
Oh, I was going to ask, can you walk us through how the technology works?
Totally. So I definitely encourage, if anybody wants to see visuals, you can go to smartgun.com. There's a big picture right on the front page. But I'll try to kind of describe it verbally here. The Biofire Smart Gun, it's a 9mm handgun designed for home defense. It's something that you would keep accessible, in a bedroom or something like that. And there's basically two things that happen as soon as you pick it up. All this is integrated directly into the firearm, so there's no external accessories, attachments. Biofire is building, designing, manufacturing the entire firearm from the ground up, which is something that we've had to do to actually be able to solve the key challenges here from a technical perspective. There's a fingerprint sensor set into the side of the grip. It comes in a right and left-handed configuration, so depending on your dominant hand, that will be basically positioned pretty much underneath the middle finger of your primary hand. And additionally, pretty much as a backup, we have a 3D infrared facial recognition system that's on the rear of the firearm. And the way that we look at this is that those are two redundant systems. So it's not multi-factor authentication, right? You don't need both the fingerprint and the facial recognition, but rather just one or the other. And the benefit of that is, again, reliability is really the number one key concern here, right? It's got to work every single time that you pick it up. And similarly, it needs to never work when somebody who you don't trust gets access to it. And fingerprints are a tremendous biometric, extremely commercially mature, have received 20, 25 years of optimization. And in general, we can run a very, very, very effective authentication process just based on fingerprint data alone. However, the obvious challenge to anybody who has a smartphone, knows about fingerprints, is that they don't work in all conditions, right? If your hands are sufficiently wet or dirty, if you mess up your grip and don't actually quite get your finger actually physically on the sensor, it's not going to work, right? And so we ended up adding the facial recognition system, which in many ways is dramatically more complicated, at least an order of magnitude, maybe two, depending on how you define it. It requires streaming image processing. You're running neural networks, and at the same time, the benefit of facial recognition is that it works in any environment. I don't care how you pick the firearm up. I don't care what your grip looks like, how dirty you are. It's very, very, very robust to environmental conditions. And so the two of them combined have allowed us to deliver a very consistent and seamless experience.
And taking a step back from the tech, why did you decide to approach it this way? When you started getting this idea, thinking about wanting to do something like this, you could have made a better gun safe, there are a lot of other approaches you could have taken. So why biometrics, and why did that make sense? Was that your first idea?
It's a great question. It was not. And I think this is a great example of something that I encourage every company to do at the early stages and then do again with any new product that you're thinking about, which is we really went out to our customers and figured out, all right, what do they actually need? And one of the challenges for us is, I'll be back later today talking about dual use and how do you think about kind of national interest startups, but our first product is a consumer product. It is not designed for the needs of our law enforcement. It's not designed for the needs of our military. It's designed for the needs of average Americans. And the challenge with that is that the average American doesn't exist. The average American is a conglomeration of 300 plus million people. And so we spent 18 months, I ended up going to MIT briefly, taking a Thiel fellowship and dropping out, and that's really where kind of the core iteration, ideation on the product happened. We spent 18 months as a tiny little scrappy company talking to customers, right? Talking to as many people as we could find that met sort of our thesis for what a customer was going to look like here to really understand what they needed. And in particular, they needed a couple key things. They wanted it to be extremely reliable, they wanted it to be fast, and they wanted it to be very tamper resistant, right? If one of the primary areas where we can have impact is unfortunately teen suicide. There's a tremendous number of suicide attempts in the United States every year, over 1 million attempts. And at the same time, a very, very small percentage of those, about 3%, result in the person dying. And unfortunately, when you include firearms, those numbers totally change, right? It goes from a 3% lethality rate to an over 90% lethality rate. And so I obviously don't think that a Biofire smart gun is going to have any impact on what's happening in a teen's life that is having them look to commit suicide. But if we can remove that firearm from the situation, right, it dramatically changes the outcome. Because of people that survive a suicide attempt, over 90% of them get help, get treatment, move through it on their own, and don't die by suicide in long-term studies, which, to be clear, I wish those numbers were all 0 and 100% as appropriate. But at a minimum, we can dramatically improve the success rate, the successful outcome there for a lot of people. And that means that it has to be resistant to tampering. So going back to better gun safes, better gun locks, there's really two key things that you can only do with a smart gun. And the most important one is that it's always locked by default. And I said that a couple times, but that really is a paradigm shift, right? Every other gun on the planet, you have to take an action to put it back in a gun safe. And all responsible gun owners will do that, but we're all human, and you can make a mistake. And unfortunately, that one mistake is potentially catastrophic. And with our product, it flips that whole paradigm on its head. There's no action required to lock it. It just automatically locks whenever it leaves your control. And that's really the only way I can think of to actually fully eliminate firearms being accessible by teens and children, right? To the extent that firearms are accessible by teens and children today, it's almost entirely a result of those kind of mistakes. And you can't do that with a gun safe.
And I'm curious how you think about risk. Like this isn't a B2B SaaS company where there isn't a ton of risk on the founding team if things were to go wrong, because things can only go wrong to a certain extent. But of course, like you mentioned earlier, the metrics you have on the gun, they have to work every single time. How do you think about risk as you've built this company?
It's a great question. In a lot of ways, the primary risk that we focus on is product liability, right? It's the is the product going to perform the way that we say it's going to? And while there are some special protections in place for how firearms are used, there's a variety of federal law in place there that shields gun manufacturers from certain kinds of liability. It very explicitly does not address product liability because I think that's as it should be, right? We should be held accountable to building a product that actually meets what we say in our marketing statements. And in certain ways, the answer to that is very complicated. In certain ways, the answer to that is quite straightforward, which is you have to build a really good product. And for us, we spent about 4.5 years just iterating on a product and going through iteration cycles, improvement cycles, test and validation cycles. And in particular, we have almost entirely hired folks from aerospace and medical devices because those are the two industries where you see a similar level of technical complexity coupled with a similar level of risk, right? It's a big deal if your rocket blows up, right? It's a big deal if your pacemaker suddenly stops working. And I would argue those are, in many cases, very similar levels of risk from a product liability perspective, similar levels of quality and reliability that you need to see. And so we've wholesale ripped off the huge portions of, in particular, aerospace engineering methodology around how do you run validation, how do you structure requirements. And the reason for that is what we're building in many cases is really much, much more similar to a small satellite that just doesn't happen to go to space than a traditional firearm, right? The order of magnitude of complexity, the kinds of challenges that we've had to solve really are much more similar to that. And commensurately, you need a validation and a test process that is designed to handle that level of complexity. So the short answer on how we think about risk is, first and foremost, we need to make sure the product is going to be the level of reliability that it is. And it's taken many, many years, and again, many, many dollars to get to that point. And only very, very recently have we been where I feel is, all right, this is something that I would trust my life with. It's something that I think is appropriate to put in the hands of our customers based on all of that testing and data.
And I guess speaking about risk, how does a company like this approach data privacy and cybersecurity? Because I imagine people are giving you their fingerprints, their faces. How do you approach building something that protects all of that data?
Totally, another great question. Biofire basically designs to what we would call a zero trust environment, and one where, from a cybersecurity perspective, we think the worst case threat actor is ourselves, me compelled by a subpoena, right? Because I know everything about how the system is designed, we have access to all the backend systems. And so we've set a very, very, very high bar for what does that actually mean. In particular, Biofire has no access to any biometric data. We have no access to any personally identifiable information. That information never transits through our servers. It's stored encrypted at rest. It's stored encrypted in transit within the firearm. And the firearms themselves are air-gapped devices. It would be very tempting to throw a Bluetooth radio in there or add a Wi-Fi module. And there's a lot of features that we've gotten many, many requests from our customers for that can be enabled by that. But we've made a very, very deliberate decision that the firearm is going to have no wireless communications of any kind, no radio, no Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, GPS, etc. It's all local, and that's something that really allows us to focus on a core subset of your traditional sort of cybersecurity risk and do a really, really, really good job at it. And it's something that we've partnered with tremendous experts in the cybersecurity space, as well as honestly, I think rather substantially over-designed what this needs to be to protect our customers' privacy. And so, most important, the easiest answer I can say is we never have any of that information, and then there's no risk that our service could be hacked and that information could be leaked.
And I know something that you and I spoke about when we talked way long ago, even though it was only a few months ago, it feels like forever, is that you don't think you could have built this company, say, 7, 8 years ago, because you would not have been able to secure the funding that you guys have been able to now, because the perception and the sort of approach to investing in companies like this in Silicon Valley has completely changed in the last couple of years. So maybe it'd be great if you want to talk about that and sort of how you think about fundraising, and do you still struggle to land capital with certain investors?
Yeah, fundraising has been certainly one of the more challenging portions, I would say, of building Biofire. And I think fundraising is hard for almost any company that is not, smack dab in the center of whatever the latest buzzword is. In general, what Biofire is fundamentally doing at the end of the day is we're building an advanced safety-critical hardware product that also happens to be a weapon. And any single one of those kind of factors, the deep tech aspect, the hardware aspect, the criticality aspect, or the firearms aspect, is normally enough to take out about 25% at a minimum of your addressable capital pool, at least among traditional venture. And you start to stack them all together, and there's just not a lot of funds that are, from a legal perspective, even allowed to invest in Biofire. Like, don't get me wrong, we've had tremendous conversations, very, very positive with the vast majority of the folks, especially out here in Silicon Valley. But there's a lot of funds that have restrictions in their LPAs, right? That have mandates that prohibit them from investing in something like a firearms company. And so I would say it's certainly getting easier over time, right? Like as the company matures, as we reduce risk, the risk these days is very much just centered on how efficiently can we scale our manufacturing, how efficiently can we be delivering units to customers, and at what margins. Those kind of challenges and risks are well understood by a very large percentage of the investment community, whether it's within venture or the family office and private equity kind of style communities. But certainly at the early stages, there was, I would say, few very brave investors, that were actually willing to take the stand on, hey, like, this is something that should exist, and we think that Kai's the guy to do it.
And I know I don't want to take too much away from the panel you're doing later, where I'm sure you're going to touch on this, but why do you think perception from Silicon Valley VCs about categories like this has changed as of late?
Yeah, certainly I think we're all aware of the major shifts, I would say, in how Silicon Valley and more broadly, I would say, the tech community views national interest startups, defense startups. And I'm personally strongly in favor of that, right? I think for a long time, we've taken what is, I think, reasonably and arguably America's center of technical development, right? Our concentration of the top high-quality engineers and technical minds in America, and largely isolated it from core national defense interests. And there's been obviously lots of good reasons for that. I'm not going to, again, get too far into it here, but I think we've seen with growing international instability and tension, as well as with the real reality that in most cases, America is probably reasonably far behind our core adversaries from a technical perspective with respect to defense. And we're certainly not running the most efficient process either, I would say. And so I think certainly the charge has been led by companies like Anduril, and the chairman of Anduril, Trey Stevens, is one of our investors. But as well as there's a lot of other really good companies out there that have demonstrated that, hey, not only is there a very valuable business to be built here, serving the needs of the American military, but also more broadly, you can do a lot of good here. And I think that that's something that is certainly been a major shift, especially, again, because it's coupled with financial returns.
And I was actually kind of going to ask something about that in terms of, is this a type of technology that over time, as you evolve, that you can see yourself selling to maybe to like the defense or like police stations and stuff?
Absolutely. I would argue that, especially on the law enforcement side, and you could extend that into federal law enforcement, military, police, the fundamental challenge that we're solving on consumers is just as applicable for law enforcement, which is, any law enforcement officer wants to make sure that only themselves, maybe their partner, is going to have access to a firearm. And I've talked to NYPD detectives, right, folks that have been in the law enforcement space for 20, 30 years, and they say the same thing, right? They say that the number one concern, if I'm walking into a suspect's house, my number one concern is, are they going to go for my gun? And being able to provide that peace of mind, being able to provide that transparency to law enforcement officers, saying, hey, you can go test this. Like, anybody other than you and your partner gets access to that firearm, it's going to be unusable. That is extremely compelling. And for what it's worth, over 10% of law enforcement officer deaths from firearms every year are from their own guns being taken away from them and used against them. And that's certainly something that I would like to prevent.
Yeah, it seems like there's been like really good perception to the company, and I'm really curious, have any of the lobbies come after you still, even with like all the good perception?
The short answer is no. We're a member of the NSSF, which is the primary sort of trade lobby for the firearms industry. And I would say in general, the core thing about Biofire's approach is that at the end of the day, we are manufacturing firearms, right? And we're manufacturing firearms that we will sell to any American that is legally allowed to buy a handgun in their jurisdiction. And I think that's a big shift from, again, going back to those previous attempts at firearms that were not positively received. There was a lot of other things mixed up in that. There was sort of echoes of gun control. There was aspects of, this is a foreign company that's sort of coming in and looking to do this. Versus, for me, it's been very, very important from the beginning, as a gun owner myself, to say, hey, like, we need to build something that people are going to choose to purchase, right? And in particular, I think one of the biggest shifts has been, back in the kind of, smart guns 1.0 era, back 20 years ago, there was mandates in a variety of states in place that would have required that all firearms sold in a given state would be smart guns. And I think that is extremely problematic, right? We're building a very specific product, right? We're building, think of like a Model 3, right? And if you, live reasonably close to where you work and you have good access to supercharger networks and, it probably doesn't snow too much where you live, great, Model 3s are awesome. You live in middle of nowhere, Alaska, good luck. It's not going to work very well for you. And I think that kind of analogy is super important here, where we're building a specific product that is highly optimized for a single use case, which by definition means that it's suboptimal for a lot of other use cases. You would not want to conceal carry a Biofire smart gun. You would not want to use it for hunting, et cetera, et cetera. And by being able to say, we're going to focus on this, we're going to build a really good product, that's only possible because we've been able to work with legislators in a variety of states and say, hey, mandates are not the way to incentivize adoption of smart guns. The way to incentivize adoption of smart guns is to go build the best firearm that you possibly can for home defense and happen to have it be a smart gun.
And I wanted to take a step back just because we only have a couple of minutes left, but I have to know, we love asking founders questions like this, but you started this company as a high school project, and now years later you've been the entrepreneur and the founder of this company. Did you ever think when you started that project you would be here now?
No. At the end of the day, I think this has been a kind of crazy iterative whirlwind, right? Every day there's a new challenge, a new step, and all you can really do is just get up and say, all right, time to tackle the next milestone, time to tackle the next challenge. And of course, those have changed, those have gotten bigger, but I would say going back to why I got into this and my kind of approach to the world, I am looking for those challenges, right? That's what makes my job interesting, exciting, because it sucks a lot of the time, right? Being a founder is definitely not all sunshine and roses, but that ability to say, all right, like, there's a problem we need to solve, I'm the only guy who's going to be able to do it, like, let's go get it done, has been something that's definitely kept me going through the many years of this.
Wait, oh my gosh, do you have any crazy stories from like the past 13 years of building the company? Like crazy, like I want to say like crazy, like funny stories, but I don't think much is funny about like building a gun. So I mean, like what are some crazy stories that you have?
I definitely have crazy stories for you that we can talk about backstage. In terms of what we're going to talk about on stage, I think going back to that fundraising piece, like Biofire has been something where you always hear the adage of you should have a minimum of 18 months of runway, and that has not been the case for Biofire, right? It has been something where there's been stretches of years at a time where we averaged 6 weeks. And not minimum 6 weeks, average 6 weeks. And we've never missed a payroll. We've never actually, gone out of business. We're still here and we're better than ever. And I think that certainly led to a whole series of, oops, the wire missed and, we got 3 days of runway kind of thing. That's happened at least once. And in general, I'd say maybe it's not funny in a ha-ha sort of style, but certainly for me and my team looking back, it was like, wow, I can't believe we pulled that off. And to be clear, there's a reason I'm saying this on stage. Like all of our investors are, of course, fully looped in on that. But at the end of the day, it has been, I think, due to the support of tremendous investors, folks that are willing to go out there, take a risk on the future that they want to be a part of, that this has been possible. And I think I've, for better or for worse, seen that firsthand many times.
Mm-hmm. And we just only have about 45 seconds left. So 30-second answer. You guys have raised over $37 million. You are at the point you are at now. What is next?
So we shipped our very first smart guns to customers just in the last couple weeks here, which is tremendous and a huge milestone for us. Now we're very, very focused on manufacturing scaling. So we're opening up our first dedicated manufacturing facility in Colorado in the next couple months. We're going to be hiring a bunch of folks and looking to start to fulfill the backlog of orders and pre-orders that we have. And so I think it's going to be an exciting challenge to go from building tens of smart guns to building, ideally, a whole lot more than that.
Perfect. Well, we are out of time, so join me and Dom in thanking Kai for coming on Found Live today.